Hello everybody, it's Grandmama. Time for another story from a Hometown Scrapbook by Ben Weatherwax. Boy Scout Band. Hello there. Schools have started again, and just about the first organization that sounded the rally was the high school band up at Aberdeen School of Organized Learning. Even though the classes haven't started to hammer the 3 R's into young heads, the football team is practicing and the band is organizing. They were there last night in the high school's conservatory, nearly 100 of them, young fellows with musical instruments tuning up, running scales, and finding their places in the high school's big musical group. Now, the high school band has achieved some considerable platitudes for music lovers around the Northwest, and it has been honored by being asked to represent Kansas State College at the dedication of the University of Washington Stadium in Seattle this fall. And it has won many honors, both for itself and for its director. We found the page in our scrapbook one evening that told the story of the high school's music department, from the days of the 10-piece orchestra that learned heavily to fiddle, on down through the years to today's whopping musical program that permits every kid who can read a note to find a place in the school music curriculum. But tonight, we're going to turn the pages of our scrapbook back to the band that was probably the first attempt to bring music to the young folks of the harbor on a large scale. It's the story of the Boy Scout band of the mid-1920s, and incidentally, a story of a lot of young fellows who are middle-aged men today, and who look back with a nostalgic eye to the days when they umped ahead to the beat of P.J. Carabas' baton. So when Dick has said a few words from our sponsors, we'll find the story of the Boy Scout band of 1924 and of the lads who composed this musical organization. It was 1923 when the Aberdeen Boy Scout Council engaged the services of smiling Canadian-born ex-war veteran named Edward Reed Bailey Parkinson to become the town scout executive. And to the boys of the city, the man with the horn-rimmed glasses immediately became Parky, and an important figure in the affairs of boys 12 years and older. The Boy Scouts, as an Aberdeen organization, had struggled for survival since the teens, when Gordon Williams had brought the idea of youth organizations to the harbor and had started Troop 1 of the Boy Scouts among the 12-year-olds of the Terrace Heights Hills. Another attempt had been made to encourage the growing movement when Aberdeen's Rotary Club engaged Paul Young, an Aberdeen school teacher in the old Franklin School, to organize a scout troop amongst his boys and to give it the name Troop 4. That was in 1921. But the Scouts didn't take on the substance of real organization until the service and community organizations of the harbor got together in 1923 and decided to bring a full-time scout executive into the harbor. And that man, as we noted, was Parky. He came to town with a blue serge suit, a pair of battered traveling bags, and a winning smile, and took a room at Dave Keller's house on North H Street. The newly organized Scout Council provided him with a room in the basement of the Methodist Church, which was dignified with a sign that advised visitors that it was and would be the headquarters of E.R.B. Parkinson, Aberdeen Scout Executive, and the office became the headquarters for 12-year-old boys all over Aberdeen. Parky went right to work. He organized more scout troops. Willing Walter Preble took over the new Troop 8 to meet in the basement of the Presbyterian Church. Bill Hopkinson, a war veteran and a civil engineer, found time to take on a scout troop. Bert Campbell, an auto electrician, not long on the harbor, got into the work. And there were others. Scouting suddenly blossomed for Aberdeen under the professional guidance of the man they called Parky. Now, when we told you the story of Edward C. Finch, we mentioned the many philanthropic projects of this Grays Harbor promoter in his last years. Ed Finch had a solid income from the flowing black gold of the California Signal Hill, and he poured it into things that he thought would help Aberdeen. And Ed was in an expansive mood one day when W.O. McCaw, that good citizen of our town, and Edward Reed Bailey Parkinson called on him to talk about a Boy Scout band. Parky had long cherished a dream of a scout band, and in his 10 years of scouting here and there across America, he had always hoped to find a community where the boys, the money, and the will would combine to provide the talent and the instruments to organize a band. And Parky, ambitious though he was, thought that perhaps a 15-piece band would be quite a venture for Aberdeen, at least to start with. But as he told his story to Ed Finch, the slightly red-faced man with the white mustache looked far over Parky's shoulders and saw not a 15-piece combination marching band up the streets of Aberdeen, but a 20, 30, no, maybe even a 40-piece young musicians thrilling the harbor crowds with their artistry. Perhaps becoming nationally famous as Aberdeen's Boy Scout band. The enthusiasm and the imagination that he had put it into such a scheme as the First Street Railway for Aberdeen, the clearing of the platting of Finch's farm, and countless other promotions in which he had been familiar with in the past. He now turned to putting horns into the hands of Boy Scouts. As Parky recalled it later, he didn't even say, "How much will it cost me?" He just said, "Order the instruments and charge them to me." Parky went into the subject of a director for the band, and Finch cut him off halfway through with the instructions to hire one right away. In the fall of 1924, Aberdeen's Boy Scout band began to take shape. Now, hiring a musical who is willing to devote his life to teaching kids to play the piccolo and the tuba is not easy. Oh, musicians were a lot hungrier back in 1924 than they are today. There was no radio to take up the slack, and the bands and the orchestras and an occasional job with an ensemble composed just about the extent of employment for men of music. But Parky had not cherished his great dream to have it flounder on the lack of a maestro. He went to Seattle carrying an idea of what he had hoped to find. He went to the Musicians Union and told his story, and they gave him a list of names to work with. For a week, the Aberdeen Scout executive went from dance hall to civic opera houses talking with musicians. Fiddlers wouldn't do it. He wanted a band instructor, and finally he found him. Below the sidewalk on 3rd Avenue was a cafeteria that catered to a noon rush in Seattle shopping district. And for atmosphere, it provided music from a 3-piece ensemble. A piano, a fiddle, and an instrumentalist who played everything from the clarinet to the French horn. Parky ate 4 pieces of banana cream pie one noon listening to the ensemble play before he felt sure that he found the right man. That afternoon, he engaged the instrumentalist, the little Italian man by the name of Pietro C. Carabà. Mark Payette had placed an order for an instrument, and acting on Finch's direction, Parkinson had ordered liberally. But he had purposely omitted a few instruments because he felt that the band director should have the final say on just how his group should be composed. Carabà arrived in Aberdeen, took a studio at the corner of Market and G Streets, where Pickney Plumbing Company now has its warehouse, and when he had finished ordering instruments, a 40-piece band was on the horizon. Now, there had long been a theory, popular among Grays Harbor parents, that any young lad faced with the possibility of learning a musical instrument would probably run away and become a pirate. But there was something new in the approach that Parkinson and Carabaugh used, and it worked. They announced that there were a few openings still available. They brought the kids. When Pietro C. Carabaugh met with his potential musicians for the first time in the gymnasium of the Methodist Church, there were 2 boys for every instrument. In the weeks that followed, the low-clinging basketball court of the house of worship became the conservatory for Grace Harbor's music for young men. The band practiced after school and on Saturday, but the problem was not alone one of building a band. First, the maestro had to make the instrumentalist. True, there were a few young men who had previously encountered the intricacies of sharps and flats, but most of them took instruments in their hands at first scale. The studio at the corner of Market and G Street was filled with the wiry sounds, and when the weird sounds were all brought together on Saturday morning for band practice, they became such a kaleidoscope of sounds as to confound the senses. Pietro persisted. He became Pete to the boys, and the little Italian sweated over the impetus of boys who knew all the finer points of the squeeze play and had to handle a quarterback sneak, but were lost at the sight of an arpeggio. Take the flute section. Leo Elbert took the high notes on his piccolo, but Don Morgan and Milton Anderson provided the softer, more sophisticated notes. And the clarinets, Earl Keller's mother had decided that he would be a clarinetist, and he shared the hours with Lawrence Duncan, Ray Kirscher, Leo Morheim, Frank Walsh, Bernard Carman, Charles Krebs, and Jack Fowler. Oh yes, and another beginner by the name of Bob Harvey, who showed an unusual aptitude for music. The cornets were solid and strong. Harry Manhow, Ed Baker, and Leonard McCullough showed outstanding talent, and Bud Bushman, Howard Jacobs, John Giacchito, and Jack Dara came along rapidly. Kitten Levens, Bob Leroy, Wesley Estes, and Don Conan were the hornmen. Saxophonist section of the band was soothing in low keys, but give it a break, and a combination of Ronald Kirsch, Burdette Miller, John Davenport, Clyde Wiseman, and Charles Lane could turn an ear wrong side out. The trombones were irrepressible. Maynard Watson, George Savage, and Stan Smith handled those acoustical weapons. Walter Wash and Byron Paddock were the baritones. And on quiet evenings, Cosmopolis withered at the sound of young Paddock practicing his scales. The basses were Everett Berlin, Bob Irish, and Arthur Hogan. The percussion section finished the band. Neil Carnes and Dick Crime were snare drums. Howard Hanson proudly pounded the bass drum, and Joe Abbott snapped the cymbals. That was Aberdeen's Boy Scout band. Now, just a few words here for words from our sponsor and Dick Crombie. Well, it was the spring of 1925 before the Scouts were ready to perform. They had mastered their instruments, and in an unmusical way for the most of them, they had learned to march, and they were 42 members strong. Then, in the spring of 1925, Pietro J. Carabaugh presented his boys in concert, and the town turned out to applaud. From the moment on, the Boy Scout band was an important part of every parade and public demonstration, and for several years, it too grew larger and larger with its talents, and represented the harbor many times at Northwest festivals and activities. Some of the members got their musical start under Carabaugh's flaring stick and went on to make names in the world of music. Bob Harvey's smooth modern band playing today in Seattle's had its beginning with Pietro's hand by when he gave young Robert a clarinet and told him to see what he could do with it. To others, it was an experience that led to a place in the high school bands and orchestras of future dates. And to others, it was an arduous chore that was gladly forgotten when the band had played its last concert in the spring of 1927, and Pietro J. Carabara left Aberdeen behind to go back to his music stand in the Seattle cafeteria. But to all, including Edward Reed Bailey Parkinson, it was a great adventure, and one that has found its spot in this record and place in which we live, and part of our hometown scrapbook. Thanks for listening.